All right, hello and welcome to the Herald of the End Times Apocalypse Hour. I'm your host, Grizzled Survivor, and today we are joined by our good friend Greg Marsh of Vidocq.pro, one of our associates. We've done work with him before on videos and other things, and we're getting him in here today for a little bit more of a free-form conversation, and I'm sure he's got plenty of things to talk about and plenty of things to enlighten us about here. But Greg, people might not have seen the episodes of our show where you give your credentials, so why don't you go ahead and just kind of give us a brief history of your background real fast.
Okay, well, this is all reinforced by our website, Vidocq.pro, which gives users at no cost and no login and no snooping on our part of who you are, free information that is uncopyrighted for kids writing scientific studies for schools and school projects. It gives information to homeowners and people who have children in school as to what to do about indoor environmental quality and its deterioration, which happens through no fault of your own. It tells you how to identify these things and some solutions is what you can do. It has 45 or 48 or 50 scientific and technical references, as well as about 36 other help sites which provide services and information to people, especially beginners, who are realizing that they are living in a toxic world and what you do about it. My background is basically a degree in what would now be called industrial chemistry at Ohio University, who produced its first Nobel Prize-winning chemist in 2009. He was awarded the prize in chemistry for some really incredible developments in that field. I personally have worked for the government on at least 3 occasions, twice for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, including the best contract I ever had, which was to write a kernel of information that would be used to generate a Clean Soils Act, which would complement the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. At the time, we had a movie actor in the White House, and the project went nowhere when we were done with it. It needs to be resurrected. Listeners and viewers of our presentations across the internet could actually make this happen with some letters to their elected representatives.
Well, now more than ever is the time for people to write to their elected officials. I feel like there's a lot of change going on in this current election. You can see a lot of diversity on the one side of the table, the left side, but the right side's not so diverse. I feel like it's really up to the people to talk to their representatives about any issues, including these environmental issues, like you said, The Clean Soils Act is long overdue. Some of these other acts are still impacting people to this day. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all of that still gets talked about to this day. So definitely a Clean Soils Act would be something that people should write to their congresspeople about. I mean, the air and the water ties into the soil.
Oh yes, yeah, but the biggest risk to humanity and future generations without a Clean Soils Act is that frequently, nearly always really, if you have an air pollution problem, you can solve the problem, but you almost inevitably create either a water pollution problem, which is then regulated by the Clean Water Act, or it all winds up in the dirt. And what grows in the dirt? Everything we eat.
Yeah, it's an issue people fail to see, but I think a lot of that is because politicians kind of obscure, they leave facts out of everything they say. They won't tell you that, the water and the air affect the soil. I mean, you can infer that, but some people don't care. I've known a lot of people that they're not stupid, but they just are ignorant of almost every issue you can imagine. They just have no political ambition, political savvy. They are more concerned with watching, our good friend PewDiePie there, or MTV, who used to be the go-to if you were talking about brainless drivel. It's been far surpassed by YouTube, but MTV still ranks up there with mindless drivel, but some people, they want to just have their bread in circuses. They don't care if the bread's coming out of the ground that's contaminated by plutonium, as long as they just don't know that that's where it came from.
Well, that's correct. People are living in what's called La La Land. In fact, it's so common, I understand Hollywood made a movie with that name. But La La Land goes away really quick at places like the Love Canal, with Lois Gibbs becoming an activist in a matter of seconds, when the government was there in her community assuring her that the astronomical chemical dump site that the Love Canal community was built on was later, in fact, replicated at a place called Flint, Michigan. When Flint, Michigan had a serious problem with their water because it was so bad that people without spectrometers and without chromatographs could tell with their bodies that in fact the water was unfit for human consumption. And the people who had previously been living in La La Land were shocked to find out that they were swimming in really bad toxic metals that never go away. I mean, plutonium eventually breaks down into lead. It takes a while, long time, but lead is lead and arsenic is arsenic forever.
So lead pollution's it's an inevitable result of plutonium contamination, but in its own right is just terrible.
Yes.
And I guess we've known that for a long time. Lead pipes haven't been used in houses for, a long time. Is there any downside to the copper piping used in houses nowadays?
Well, that's a good point, but let's back up here a little bit. In fact, the problem with lead in plumbing, which is a word, plumium, the word for lead is plumbium, and it is used to form the periodic table symbol for lead, which is Pb. Okay? Now, what are we getting at here? Well, a long time ago, a guy named Julius Caesar connected the dots on the dangers of making plumbing out of plumbium, and now called lead, and poisoned many of his followers thousands of years ago. So we've known about this all along, but we've fallen back into La La Land, and of course the corporate media that we see on media streams of information other than YouTube and the internet in general are in fact committing the crimes of omission by not telling us about these things until they get so bad that they can't ignore them any longer.
Well, business as usual.
Now, to get back to your question about copper plumbing itself is not bad for humans. Copper ions are very destructive of game fish like trout and the things that trout feed on called minnows. They're very sensitive to copper. But the problem with copper plumbing typically is the fact that a lot of it, until relatively recently, was soldered with lead-bearing solders. So now we have it back. Now, what's happened? Well, it's now illegal for a plumber to go out into the community and do plumbing if his toolbox or truck contains even one roll of lead-based solder that used to be used in this country to solder pipes. So there's no more lead in solder. Every once in a while, though, it pops up in brass plumbing fixtures which have traces of lead in the copper alloy from which they're made. This is a problem, and it gets worse when we do a lot of recycling without the concurrent necessary quality control of the metal smelting process to make sure that in fact plumbing fixtures are made with lead-free brass. Okay.
Well, when I spoke to a recycler a couple months ago, and you were with me on that day, you heard from them as well as I did that there's no real regulation over recycling. There's no certification that you can get that certifies you in the eyes of the government as there's no government certification for recyclers. It's all independently based. And so if you're trusting the recyclers and these agencies to really have any sort of oversight, they really don't. And so if you're counting on them to make sure this is a pure brass fixture, you're just counting on a group of people that are kind of left to their own devices, and they're only as honest as their most dishonest member.
That's absolutely true. But it's worse than that. Not only are there not standards that are regularly monitored in the distribution of, in this case, plumbing fixtures, but there are no credentials for the people who are actually responsible for such a quality control program. The program does not exist, and the people and the requirements to do this work are not defined anywhere. And this is really an extension of the problems that we see with the Food and Drug Administration when it comes to, say, things that we use in and around our body. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that we are actually getting substances in the store far and away beyond the Johnson & Johnson talcum powder, which is laced with asbestos. And I'm waiting to hear from their lawyers with this statement of fact. I don't think we'll be getting any because these big corporations aren't contributing to our well-being even when we patronize their products. So we have a lack of control, we have no plan, we have no credentials for people to implement the plan. We've really dug ourselves a hole. Now, what does all this mean for all of us folks out there who are watching commercial and industrial media streams and who suddenly learn that, in fact, not only are we in last place in lifespan among all the industrialized nations of the world, but in fact, in the last 3 years, we've been losing our last place to even a more last place position in lifespan among all the nations of the industrialized world. And remember, Russia is not an industrialized country. They've got a similar problem too.
Yeah, you know, they are a crumbling relic of a superpower who's desperately trying to build themselves back up into something viable. But, you know, Russia's a completely different animal than America. We have the ability to project power outside of our neighborhood. America can go anywhere in the world they want to go and be the king boss. Our military could destroy any other military. Russia doesn't have the ability to project power outside of its immediate neighbors. So for America to be on the same level healthcare-wise as Russia is pretty terrible. And let's keep in mind that even Russia's healthcare currently is way worse than it was during the Soviet Union. I mean, the healthcare there wasn't great, but you know what? If you needed a doctor, you got seen by a doctor. Russia nowadays is very corrupt. Maybe they're trying to learn a little bit from our system here. Let's kind of switch gears a little bit, Greg. One thing I've always wondered about you, and I'm sure our listeners have probably wondered this as well, is how did you get involved with the whole Rocky Flats issue? What drug you into that? I know your background, but why did they say, Greg, we want you on our team?
Well, the team that you're referring to certainly wouldn't be the Department of Energy or the Atomic Energy Commission. But let's back up for a few minutes. Now, you were talking, and let's turn the tables here, you were talking about Russia and the Soviet Union and so forth. Why don't you tell us of your experiences and knowledge base of these issues?
Okay, well, you know, I have extensive studies in the Soviet circle, politics, history, all of that. I have studied a lot. I don't have any formalized education, but book on book I've read. I've talked to people that live there. So I feel qualified to speak on that, at least that area of the world. I can't say that my expertise applies to all countries, but certainly Eastern Europe is my bread and butter. However, and many of you might not know this, maybe some of you have heard this on my show before, in 2009, the doctor, who you've seen on an episode of my show with me out urban exploring, the doctor and myself went to Chernobyl. We spent a week in Kiev and then spent 3 days in Chernobyl, and it was just amazing. We went to Pripyat. You can find all of the photos from this on the doctor's blog, the Tumblr of his, which I'll link in the description. Just stunning, gorgeous pictures. The Ukrainian people were just so great and so nice. And what you find, though, is when you go over there, is their belief in their own government, at least in 2009, which was much the same as we have here. They see them as not representing the best interests of the people, an oligarchy that's only out for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many, and generally just incompetent, not able to get anything done. I mean, when we drove past the presidential palace in Kiev, Ukraine, the taxi driver pointed out the window and said, "That's where the clown lives." So, he said that's the circus. So, you find the common man suffers the same problems the whole world over. Now, in 2009, Kiev was very hopeful about Barack Obama, who, in my opinion, kind of came out as a flop in the end of things. Just another face on the same tired corporatocracy, basically, where the corporations control everything, and that was a problem over there as well. But they were hoping that Obama would, in helping America, help their own country, which kind of ties back into where we were just at. These other countries see America as the pinnacle of where they want to be, yet they don't realize that we are losing our life expectancy, for instance. They don't realize that we are almost, we're dead last in health. For countries of our status, they would be better off emulating a country like Norway, where the people live longer, lead happier lives, and their life's equivalent to what we have here in terms of the freedoms they enjoy and the lifestyles they lead. And Eastern Europe has always looked to America to be the be-all, end-all of what they could be. But I don't think that in the future, if we don't change the way we do things here in the States, that we're going to be able to maintain that position of where everyone wants to be. I shared a picture on my Facebook page a long time ago of, it was a life in America, the expectation versus reality, like what you see when you visit, and it was a picture of Disneyland, and it just looked beautiful, and it was versus what you see when you live here, which was a dingy basement with a guy in a really bootleg, ripped off Mickey Mouse costume. It looked like something out of a horror movie. And I think a lot of people outside of America do have that really idealized view. And I myself would like to live up to that. I don't see us doing it so now, and the way we're going, I don't see it happening in the future either for now.
Now, would you like to repeat your question to me?
Yeah, Greg, because I've always wondered legitimately. I mean, I know your background is industrial hygiene, but how did you become such an activist with Rocky Flats?
Well, I'm glad you reminded me. In my advancing years, I'm starting to have a shorter memory. Rocky Flats came to my attention when I moved to within 15 kilometers of the hottest part of the plant site. And it grew from there because I knew, as a former government employee with the Environmental Protection Agency back in Region 5, Cincinnati, that in fact many parts of the government and the EPA could not be believed. Well, nobody was talking if they had a vested interest in Rocky Flats and the real estate values in the community, trade in the community, highways and highway building and so forth. But I managed to actually submit a resume to the operators at the time, Department of Energy. That would have been about 1980. And without realizing what they actually did. At the time, people thought they made dog food because they had a checkerboard red and white painted water tower up at the site, which has been gone for a long time.
Just like the Purina plant right there in Commerce City.
Exactly, just down the road. And so there was a lot of public apathy, la-la land livers, and people who just didn't really want to know. And of course the commercial media weren't telling us either, and we didn't have YouTube at the time and the other non-commercial whistleblowing capability sources of information that the common Joe can create on his own at almost no cost, much the same as this podcast.
Yeah,
actually.
We're sitting in a coffee shop just chatting it up, and that's our agenda for today. I love being an independent journalist and telling the truth to people.
Right. Well, there's plenty of truth to be known because the commercial media hasn't shared much of it with us. And as Professor Harvey Nichols, who's been on our side and was one of the 8 original scientists on the Rocky Flats debacle, has said, corporate America and corporate media has been extremely economical with the truth. And this is absolutely true. And that's another reason I got involved, because I kept this issue of what they were doing up there kept popping up. Well, pretty soon I realized that with my background of quitting the United States Environmental Protection Agency, primarily because of unsafe working conditions at the Newtown Fish Toxicology Laboratory, where I did my research helping to establish stream standards for toxic metal discharges by corporate America. Well, I left that part of the world. I left the EPA and realized that wherever I went in this country, I was going to have to deal with the EPA and their half-truths, untruths, and in fact, their crimes of omission. Crimes of omission. Well, not too long after I found out about Rocky Flats, I found out about the 8 Boulder scientists, and one of them's name was Edward Martell, PhD, a long-term employee of the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. And he would profoundly state the crimes of omission. And we can't forget that, because when you turn on commercial TV instead of YouTube and real public streams of legitimate information, the crimes of omission are very, very prevalent.
Oh, I have an example of that. Actually, this ties right into what we're talking about in the Denver Post recently, where they were talking about the toll road that they want to build on the edge of the former Rocky Flats site. And they mentioned that this had been contested by environmental activists. They don't say why they didn't want them to build there. They don't say it was because of plutonium. The article just simply glosses over the whole thing like a bunch of crazy wackos that wanted to protect the groundhogs didn't want you to build a road through here, instead of saying a bunch of concerned citizens who don't want plutonium to be kicked up into the surrounding communities didn't want this road to be built through there. And so even the Denver Post, which is a place many people in Colorado, almost everyone that reads the newspaper is going to be reading the Denver Post, and they're getting a very skewed, very crimes of omission are present right in that article. By not mentioning why the activists didn't want the road built, by omitting that fact, you are complacent with the Rocky Flats people that caused the contamination in the first place.
Well, they were not only causing the contamination, they were being paid megabucks for products whose testing would eliminate humanity on the planet. They were making triggers for thermonuclear weapons. If you go out and test them in the design method that they were to be used, there would be no one to collect the fees from bad manufacturing techniques. And of course, the rich guys would be in their helicopters going to the southern hemisphere to escape what they'd done in the northern hemisphere of the planet, which is where most people live, by the way. So it's a really, really bad situation. Now, to continue on with my interest, after we formed the Rocky Flats Cleanup Commission, which was formed to supply the policies required under the Technical Assistance Grant Program of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, which was later, at the end, illegally defunded because it was defunded in an arbitrary and capricious way for illegitimate reasons. I was in my little study in my abode, and I received a letter one day, unsolicited, from a colleague who was a chemist. He didn't work for EPA. He worked for what was called the Bureau of Standards. The Bureau of Standards is now called the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. They build and manufacture and create and establish real quality control in the form of standards for chemical and other analyses for all kinds of things. Well, he pointed out to me that their standard reference material, SRM 4353, was labeled plutonium in soil from Rocky Flats. This sample, which was 85 grams and cost $210, could be used and was intended for use and is apparently being used quite a bit because they had to make another standard by researchers and other people in the laboratories of the scientific world around the world. Okay? So standard reference material 4353, which you can look up on your internet connection anytime you want, from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, says it all. Well, where was standard reference material 4353 taken? Well, it was taken just inside the outer perimeter fence at the southeast corner of the Rocky Flats plant, which is upwind and upstream of the greater Denver area. Just the same as the Herald nuclear weapons plant Superfund megasite is situated adjacent and upwind to Cincinnati, Ohio, which is another place that I had lived too close to for too long without knowing it. Well, that piqued my interest even more in Rocky Flats.
Sounds like you had a vested interest because you've been exposed to so many of these radioactive sites without even knowing. And this is what I'm getting at when I talk about you don't need to go to Chernobyl to experience the wasteland right in your backyard.
That's
you might
right.
be living in the damn wasteland and not even know it.
And the government is not going to tell you. The Food and Drug Administration is chronically underfunded. And the fact that we're still not using thalidomide is quite fascinating, but not an assurance that they're doing their job with the adequate funding they need to protect us. It's a form of quality control. And as I pointed out in other productions of this type, quality control is always a sink for resources and never ever a source of revenue. So when you buy something, maybe a dress, maybe a car, maybe an automobile tire, whatever, you can be sure that the amount of quality control invested in that product before you get it is at an absolute minimum. It's caveat emptor all the way around in a society that has unfunded regulatory agencies, underfunded regulatory agencies, and regulatories and regulations that do not yet exist.
Yeah, and also private companies that are responsible for regulating entire industries such as recycling.
That's right, and it goes worse than that, because in fact, private companies make big money by creating phony scientific studies sometimes of things that are critical to the regulatory agencies. These are getting more and more attention now as they're becoming more and more well known to the general public.
Well, just before we get into our next topic, because I kind of have a big topic that's going to take a big block of time to talk about, I'd just like to remind our listeners you're listening to the Herald of the End Times Apocalypse Hour on the Grizzled Survivor channel. Today we've got Gregory Marsh with us talking about various aspects of not only his own background, the Rocky Flats experience, but just chemistry in general, and we're dealing with a variety of news topics and other things. We are completely self-funded right now on our show. We have no oversight, so therefore you're not getting any censorship like you see with the corporate media. Everything you hear is, just as straight as we can get it to you, and that's how this show is going to continue to be. We don't take bribes, I guess, is an easy way to put it. We're more concerned with saving the world, so to speak. So, Greg, before we get into this next big topic that I have, I'm just going to back you up a little tiny bit. You mentioned another nuclear weapon site in a completely different state, thousands of miles away from Rocky Flats, that has the exact same issues. And I noticed that almost every former plutonium processing site in this country is unsafe. Is that just an indicative sign that the process itself is unsafe, or is that more of a sign that these nuclear weapons plants just aren't following the procedures that are set?
Well, again, all quality control is a sink for resources and never a source of revenue. Now, I'd like to quote John Glenn, America's first spaceman, astronaut. And John Glenn was sitting on the top of a big rocket at Cape Canaveral in, I think it was after Sputnik in 57 or 58. Don't quote me on the date. And he said, "I can't believe I'm sitting on top of this rocket that I know was built by the lowest bidder." Well, it worked. And he went up in space for a period of time, not very long, and came back and is still around to talk about it. So that's saying something, but it gives an undue perception of quality that we take for granted that actually does not exist.
Yeah, that sounds like it. And one thing I'm finding, any dealings with the government, they're going to just go for the lowest bidder, and that's not good for you or I as people in the country that have to deal with the sometimes literal fallout from these products that they've made. I mean, the entire world's blanketed in trace radiation from nuclear weapons testing. You and I didn't have a choice about that, and you don't have any choice but to be exposed to it. You have no choice.
Well, yeah, and getting back to the original, an earlier question concerning why am I interested, when I actually got out here to Colorado, I realized that I grew up downwind, at least part-time, of the Miamisburg Mound nuclear weapons facility in Miamisburg, Ohio. In the middle 1950s, we would take our 2-week vacations in Florida in the wintertime. Well, in 1957, December in fact, we were the wonderful visitors of the great state of Florida, the Sunshine State, which is extremely different from, say, Dayton, Ohio, where I grew up, and I wouldn't wish that on a cat, by the way, not just because of the Miamisburg Mound nuclear weapons facility, but because of many other things, including apathy. Now, okay, so where did we go? Well, we went to Florida. Well, where in Florida did we go? Well, it turns out we went to Indian Rocks Beach, before it was a madhouse of concrete and steel that it is now. And I only know that from the reports I've heard from people that have actually been there. Well, what does all that boil down to? Well, it turns out that the Pinellas Nuclear Weapons Plant Superfund Megasite is in Clearwater, Florida. Well, you don't need Google Maps, but if you got a 1957 map of Florida, or any other time for that matter, you can find that Clearwater, Florida is like a stone's throw from Indian Rocks Beach. And when did this plant open up? Well, it opened up in 1957. Well, okay, I was there in December of 1957 the first time, and for a number of times thereafter. What does that mean? Well, when they were starting to use all those radiotoxic substances at the Pinellas plant, I was right next door later on that same year. From the very beginning, I learned this after I moved to Colorado's Front Range in 1978.
And it's not like Greg was trying to move close to these places that were polluted. He just stated he tried to get away from one source of contamination and moved unwittingly and unknowingly right next to another source of contamination, only to come to Colorado and be close to yet another source of contamination. And I think that that speaks less about Greg's choices to live in these areas and more about the fact that there might not be that many safe areas in this world, which brings us to how I kind of want to wrap up our last 25 minutes here, as I'm sure we could talk a lot about it, is our good friend Hector Balderas, the Attorney General of New Mexico, who we wrote a letter to concerning very much of the same topic we've been talking about, mine tailings in New Mexico that are unregulated and uncontained, and there's no sort of oversight to these pilings of toxic chemicals that not only are affecting New Mexico, but also people that live in southern Colorado. And so we wrote him a very, not a very sternly worded letter, but certainly called him out on his commitment to the people of New Mexico. He talks a big game about being on their side, you know, wanting to be the guy who everything I do is for the people of my state, and I have their best interests at heart. And we found some disturbing stuff going on in Cuestas, New Mexico, so we wrote him a letter. We have yet to hear back from him. It's been a couple weeks since we sent the letter off. But I feel like maybe, having the letter writer here to kind of talk a little bit more about the situation might be good. So, much like, he got interested in Rocky Flats, when we heard about Cuestas, New Mexico, Greg was right on the case. Greg, what did you find?
Well, the whole thing came to my attention when I, in my professionally required, constant, lifetime training in various forms, put me at a presentation from Agilent Instruments International, whatever, they're a spin-off from a company that you might have heard of. And it's called Hewlett-Packard. Well, Agilent is the instrument manufacturing arm of Hewlett-Packard, but I think it's an independent corporation now. Nevertheless, they put on a very, very fine presentation of the latest rounds of inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectrometers in Boulder, Colorado earlier in 2018. It was June, I believe. I encountered a young lady there who had been a kid in a school that was a stone's throw and downwind, directly downwind of a molybdenum mine owned by Molycorp at the time and now owned by Chevron. She had been, and still is, a realtor with a long background in bookkeeping. But she had been hired by Chevron's contractor, Golder Associates, to run this instrument, an exotic instrument that should have at least a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry operator who was a real chemist. She was a realtor. She is running this instrument allegedly to meet EPA regulations and the state of New Mexico's regulations for toxic emissions from this massive mining operation, which is no longer mining molybdenum, but still a source of poison for the school nearby and the community throughout Cuesta, which is about 30 kilometers south of Colorado. Well, you can look it up on the map and get your ideas. The wind comes out of the west down there too, and it's blowing this stuff all over the place because it's not under control. I knew of this when she was a small kid in the elementary school being affected. And because we had gotten, not an associate, but Professor Nichols of the University of Colorado had gotten a Mayday call from the townspeople there asking if we could come down and give them a hand figuring out what to do. That never happened because they couldn't afford to pay the gasoline money that we were going to use to get to their site. And that's tragic.
Yeah, the government didn't want to help these people out at all. See, the people themselves were reliant on funding this study. But the fact that we've known about this for years now, and still the same problems go on, that's pretty concerning. And so we were hoping perhaps the new Attorney General and his commitment to excellence in serving his people we offered to go out there and do the surveying ourselves for very little cost. I mean, it would be more cost of me and Greg to go out there to do this, but we offered to do it. And yeah, we haven't heard anything back. I'm going to stop short of saying that perhaps his commitment to the people isn't as great as he proclaims it to be. Maybe he's just a real busy guy. Maybe we're just small potatoes. Maybe these little tiny kids that are being poisoned daily, and more than little kids, but let's just throw back to the fact that this is right next to an elementary school. The most vulnerable people in our society are being exposed to these insults. It's just not right to me. That doesn't sit well with me, and I would hope an Attorney General wouldn't sit well with them either. But as we said in our letter, we are going to continue to provide regular updates about it, and this is the first update. There's no update, which I think is an update in itself.
And the letter is on Facebook.
Yes, if you go to the Grizzled Survivor Facebook page, it is posted right at the top of the page. You can read the letter in its entirety, and you can see our offer to him. You can see Greg's concerns about the people. The way it sounds is the person operating this equipment, that I would be more certified to run this equipment. I have no degree, but just by my association with Greg and the fact that I have talked to him for as long as I have, it seems like I would be more competent with this machine.
Well, that's probably true, and which isn't to say we'd want to hire him for the job, but we wouldn't. In fact, keep in mind, we sent this letter to the Attorney General, and made it clear not to receive an unsolicited contract to do anything.
Yeah, we offered to do this for no money.
Yeah, we are not in the business of getting an unsolicited contract.
No, we're in the business of saving the world.
By anybody in New Mexico, and we're hoping that we'll start getting some feedback on the things that they can do. I mean, if nothing else, they can go to our website, Vidocq.pro, VIDOCQ.pro, and start getting tuned in to what they need to do to pull themselves out of the la-la land that they have realized they are not in.
Right.
And they need some help from the other people of New Mexico and southern Colorado.
Well, I will be sending a link to this podcast to Mr. Balderas there so he can see our rebuttal to his lack of contact with us. We did say we were going to pursue this, and we did say we were going to put him, basically, to use a kind of a street term, we're going to put him on blast about this, and question his commitment to the people. But what you can do as listeners to this show is you could voice your own concerns to him, voice your own concerns to your own attorney generals about this sort of thing. If you live in Colorado, this is an issue that affects multiple states, and I feel like a lot of this contamination present in our country is issues that affect more than one state. If a river in Colorado is polluted, that water goes to other states. You've seen it on my show on the Platte River. Once you get past a certain point, that detergent smell in the river is just there. You can go 2 or 3 miles downriver from that, and that smell is still there. The chemicals are not getting washed out of the water magically between the 10 feet it takes to come out of the sluice and then go down the river. I mean, people in Nebraska are getting chemicals from Colorado's water.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And it's not the first time.
No. So, Mr. Balderas, if you do take the time to listen to us, we'd appreciate a response. If not, we're going to continue our activities. We may even go down there with a video camera and show you guys firsthand what's going on down there and why this is so important. But I do urge you guys to write to Mr. Balderas maybe and urge him to take action for the people, because the secret is, guys, it's not just Hector Balderas in New Mexico that's doing this. It's endemic in our country. The officials don't really care about your health. The ones that do lack any sort of authority to impose their will on in any meaningful way. And you can see this most with our current administration, where the president himself funds a study to talk about global warming, and these people such as Greg here that are highly educated and have the background necessary give him this report, and he simply says, I don't believe it. Well, then why did you pay to have the report done if you're not going to listen to the experts in the field? So from Hector Balderas to Donald Trump himself, we have this problem in our country.
There we go. That's a wrap.
All right, that's us wrapping up our talk with Mr. Greg Marsh there of our associates at Vidocq.pro. Link in the description there. As for myself, the Grizzled Survivor, I'd like to wrap up today's episode with giving you an update on the channel over the next couple months here. You're mainly going to be seeing a lot more of the public domain survival films, simply because I have a lot of work outside of YouTube to do, and I don't want to not have consistent content for you guys. So that is one concession that I'm going to make. However, I do have a lot of urban exploration footage and other things like that ready to go as well. It just requires a little bit of editing, and so I will be putting those videos up. Probably somewhat out of chronological order. Those of you who watched my latest video where I go into that tunnel there by Clear Creek, notice that I was referencing stuff that you have not seen before, and so I will be working to try to upload it in the best chronological order I can, But there's some really interesting stuff we've got coming up. Some abandoned buildings, some really crazy stuff that I have found while out wandering. You really want to tune in over these next couple months, because instead of going out and recording new footage, I'll actually be forced to sit down and consolidate the footage that I already have, as well as, I'm writing scripts for a lot of other projects, such as the Doomsday Cult series, a review of a Doom mod called Ashes 2063, which I think everyone should go out and play, and you'll see why. But these videos require a little bit more time and effort, and I don't have a lot of the time to devote to them right this second. So writing the scripts is important. Doing the voice work's important. It's become a chore to even play through a game such as Ashes 2063 to get the footage I need for the review, because I don't have a lot of time in my personal life right now. So just bear with me. We'll also be doing more of these podcasts where I have a free-form way to talk to you and to get to news in a timely manner. And that's about what you can expect from me for the next couple months. And I do appreciate everyone following me and listening to these podcasts and watching the videos and coming with me and exploring these places that your average person wouldn't go. Well, to wrap things up for the entire podcast, I would like to talk about the Doomsday Clock being moved to 2 minutes to midnight, and that is mostly due, they said, to the nuclear brinksmanship between the United States and Russia. Once again, we're engaged in an arms race here in the States with the Russians, and I'm not supportive of that in the slightest bit. I don't think the world needs more nuclear weapons. The weapons that are out there are certainly very destructive, as we've seen from Rocky Flats. Even producing these weapons is very, very dangerous. And so the more of them you're making, the worse off things are going to be. So I really think that nuclear weapons are really not the way to go. Russia and the United States just have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world already. What the advances in technology, I understand the deterrence factor. If you have some sort of missile that your enemies can't intercept, that makes you more dangerous, but there's already so many missiles that these people are going to fire that there would be no way to intercept them all. It would just be a nuclear Holocaust scenario that we are preparing for, sadly, on our show here. We do prepare for the eventual collapse of civilization, whether it's a thermocene disaster where the planet heats up and becomes untenable to life, or a socio-economic disaster where the order of civilization breaks down and there's far-flung rioting, looting, just the rule of law would be gone, to a nuclear holocaust, which is a combination of all of our worst nightmares, a thermocene, socio-economic, radiological disaster that a lot of people don't have any scope or concept of what that would entail. Games like Fallout, games like Stalker, they're sugarcoating what you're going to see. Movies like Mad Max, movies like, I don't know, Escape from New York, those type of movies are sugarcoating what you would be dealing with. Books like The Road come the closest to describing the horrors of a nuclear Armageddon, as well as shows like Threads, which was a BBC documentary, very graphic for its time, and its portrayal of the stark realities of nuclear war. So the fact that the atomic clock, the Doomsday Clock here, is being moved to 2 minutes to midnight, and the main reason given by the scientist was the nuclear brinksmanship, shows that once again, shows like mine, YouTube channels like mine, may become a valuable resource to you. We'll get in next podcast to the difference between doomsday prepping and what I advocate for, which is more of a community-based solution and solutions on how to not just hoard resources for this Armageddon scenario. That is not, it's not tenable if you don't have the means to grow your own food. and power your stuff via solar power, or know how to work on these motors and stuff. So we'll get into a lot more of that in the next coming weeks. But I feel like, unfortunately, as much as I would like to talk to you more, I have to cut it off. So this is the Grizzled Survivor. We will have a lot more of these podcasts coming up, and just stay tuned for more content. I will do my best to keep the survival videos interesting. The urban exploration videos don't need to be kept interesting. They're going to just ramp up in intensity. And as for the other series that we are working on, we've got a lot to cover. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening to me and Greg ramble. Greg and I suppose, would be the more grammatically correct way to say that. And, yeah, happy survival. So as I was getting ready to upload this podcast, a news blurb came across that I feel like I need to squeeze in here. The Rocky Flats Right to Know folks apparently have sued the government to release documents showing whether or not Rocky Flats is truly safe and showing whether or not the government did enough to clean up the site. This is a huge victory for us. We can only hope that we get this through. And if you're here in Colorado or even anywhere in the nation affected by this contamination, I really urge you to contact your congressperson and demand that we get these records unsealed here, because that's going to be a huge, huge, huge step in combating these former military and industrial sites that are so contaminated, and getting the access to the documentations that people need to really be able to prove and that these government officials did this, and to hold them accountable for their actions. And so stay tuned on that. I'll have more updates on that as things go on. I'm assuming at the next Rocky Flats Right to Know meeting, this certainly will be an issue that comes up. So I will keep you posted. Thanks for tuning in here to the Herald of the End Times Apocalypse Hour, and we will see you next time.